Now let's look at how to actually create an XML document. How do you create a structured document using XML? So let's look again at this oatmeal recipe that we were looking at before. So first of all, XML, like Dublin Core, is made up of elements and values. And an element can have attributes. Each attribute also has a value. In XML, elements can have child elements. And in this particular display, the little triangle allows you to collapse an element so that recipe info can get blown up or collapsed back down. So elements can have child elements. Recipe info is an element, right? It starts here and ends here. And there are four child elements of recipe info: blurb, genre, author, and yield. Ingredient list is an element, and ingredient list has the child element ingredient, and ingredient has the child elements quantity, unit, and food item. There is a parent-child relationship in place here where you have larger elements with sub-elements under them. And in fact, you can draw this as a family tree or a hierarchical tree. And this kind of data structure is actually called a tree, not surprisingly. And you'll recognize this as the way you would draw any kind of a family tree, right? You've got recipe, which has the child elements, recipe, info, and ingredient list. I'm just going to abbreviate that here, right? And there are other child elements of recipe, and ingredient list has one child ingredient, and ingredient list has, as I said, three children itself: quantity, unit, and food item. So we have a family tree, if you will, a tree of XML elements. Notice that the values that are assigned to these elements are embedded in between the open and close of that element declaration, right? What is the food item? The food item is powdered milk. What's the quantity? 2. And all of the children, all the child elements of an element, are embedded in between the open and the close of the parent element. Quantity, 1 cup, raisins, in between open and close of ingredient. So the value assigned to an element is the text that you see, in this case, on the page. Also notice that none of these elements have attributes. And we'll come back to attributes right now. So this is a piece of the same recipe we were just looking at. Ingredient, 3 cups of quick oats, etc. An alternative way to represent this recipe would be like this. Suddenly, the element ingredient has the attribute food item. Food item has the value quick oats. Food item is an attribute of the element ingredient, but I've left quantity and unit as their own child elements. An alternative way still to represent this recipe is like this. And now food item, quantity, and unit are all attributes of ingredient. There is no rule in XML that says whether to use elements or attributes in any given situation. In other words, this is just as valid a way of representing this recipe as the way that it was originally represented, with food item, quantity, and unit all their own child elements. I've seen recommendations in both directions, and I'm not going to tell you which way to do it because this isn't a course on XML, and frankly, it's a bit context specific anyway. Depends on what you're trying to accomplish with your XML document. The only thing you need to know is that you cannot have multiple attributes with the same name in the same element. So for example, you can't say ingredient, food item, quick oats, quantity 3, unit cup, food item, powdered milk, etc., and pile all of that into one ingredient element, right? Because then you get collisions of attributes. You have more than one thing that's called food item, and that just isn't going to work in XML. Attributes are very common in HTML. HTML makes very heavy use of attributes, as we'll see in a moment. Again, this is the website for my school, and let's look at the source of this page. The meta tag, meta, is the element. The attribute is name and content. And the value for name is description or keywords. The value for content is, UNC sills, and the content for keywords is all of these various keywords. So what you have is the meta element and then two attributes, name and content. Let me scroll down a bit and show you again the element image, img, which tells your browser, put an image here. The attribute is source, and that is the address for where the image to display lives. And then alt is another attribute which tells you what the alternative text is to display if that image doesn't display on the page. So again, we have the element, image, and two attributes. So let me reiterate. In HTML, all elements and attributes are predefined. When you want to specify, put an image here on the page, you must use the image element, and you must use the source attribute to tell your browser where to go to find the image to display. Alt is actually an optional attribute, but if you want alt text, that's the attribute you must use, right? In HTML, all elements and attributes are predefined. In XML, you get to create any elements you want with any attributes you want. And that's wonderful because that allows you to create the structure for any kind of document you could possibly want. But that raises the question, how does your browser know how to interpret those elements and attributes? You and I know what an ingredient is because we eat oatmeal and cookies, but your computer doesn't. Your computer doesn't know what an ingredient is without something specifying the semantics of how to interpret the ingredient element and whatever attributes that element has. So how does your browser know how to interpret the semantics of an XML document? The answer is in our next video.